takes place in a reality where superheroes, but they're called custodians, live amongst regular people without them knowing. And this has been their reality within the story for essentially forever. How this is done is through certain superheroes who actually have the ability to control memories and to remove memories. And there's this one person with a lot of power who can do the memory thing, and he just collectively wipes memory all of the time. But this world literally makes no sense. Okay, so let's say that there is one guy who is so powerful that he could forever just always know which situations he's supposed to be wiping from the memory of all the normal people, and I guess he never does anything else, like even sleep ever? Okay, all of these other heroes are still doing hero stuff. It's a big part of the book and is a big part of the world. They are always saving people and always apprehending criminals and stopping them. What do they do with the criminals that they stop? Do they just let them go? Do they kill them? Allow me to paint a picture for you. The year is 2015 and I am approximately a moron, 15 years old. And I have been a decently big fan of the YouTube channel CinemaSins for several years at this point. Yet, in 2015, my interest and loyalty have started to waver quite a bit in regards to the channel, even after watching literally all of their videos. Well, why, then? 3 reasons. The first was that YouTube's algorithm changed. It had started promoting much longer videos. For CinemaSins, this started with their 2012 video and quickly deteriorated from there. As their videos grew longer and longer to accommodate the new algorithm and try and get themselves pushed into it, they also became a lot more sloppy and careless. And also extremely nitpicky, like more so than me. And sometimes they would just flat out lie or make up certain sins in order to keep the count going to make the video longer. The second reason is that I watched a behind the scenes type of video around this time, made, I'm pretty sure by CinemaSins. I can't remember the video itself. I just remember what I saw in the video. And what I saw was basically a how we make our videos kind of setup, where CinemaSins was walking the audience through the process of how CinemaSins makes their videos. The carelessness of it put a really weird taste in my mouth. And it mostly surrounded the fact that they often admitted blatantly that they were intoxicated for most of the process and joked around about the whole process like it wasn't that big of a deal, and like their audience were essentially morons who wouldn't notice. The final nail in the coffin, though, for me, and the third reason, was that one of the 2-member team, Jeremy Scott, wrote a book, The ABLES. At the time that it was announced and available for pre-order, I was still a pretty big fan of the channel, and I was still decently loyal to watching their videos when they came out. And so, I pre-ordered it almost immediately. I was intrigued by 2 parts of this book's existence, the first just being the premise of the book. The premise of the book, which I will get into more later, is about disabled kids in a superhero world, who are superheroes. And so, for me, I thought that that'd be so interesting to engage with and to hear the voice that is often underrepresented and often not even mentioned in most superhero platforms, and give it space. And I was already engaged, even without the second point of my engagement being the fact that it was written by Jeremy Scott. It was more than me being a fan, this aspect of my intriguement. These guys' content hinged almost entirely on being critical of media, but there are very common themes in what they were critical about. So by default, knowing that that is so important to these people's brand and to the way that they themselves consume media, I just kind of set my default in the understanding that whatever came out, no matter if it was great, good, or okay or bad, it would at least be carefully done and would be unique. I expected them to make something creatively that reflected new and unique ideas that drove away from all of the stuff that they seemed to dislike and hate on so critically in their channel. I got this instead. Allow me to explain why this book earned my unsubscription. When the book arrived, I was excited. I never read this book with the intention of disliking it, and I never wanted to dislike it. In 2015, the book looked like this. As far as covers go, I thought it was a pretty good one. Though it did take me getting about halfway through the book before I realized that this was a scene of a fire and not a sunset, but that's probably just on me. Now, the cover looks like this. Another good cover. This new cover and new edition of the book essentially was released last year in 2019. A year before the second book, which we will talk about in another video, was released this year in 2020, actually this month. The cover change is a reflection of a big change in the books themselves. Story-wise, the first book is the same as the first book from 2015, but from 2015 to 2019, The ABLES was picked up by an actual publishing company instead of the non-traditional publishing company that had taken it back in 2015. I'm not willing to pay the shipping fees that comes with most of even the cheaper versions that I've been able to find, so you're just going to have to take my word on this next part. And I don't have the book any longer because after I read it in 2015, I actually threw it away. From the moment that I first opened this book as a 15-year-old, the red flags were very, very apparent. And I mean before I even read a word, because the formatting was all messed up. The usual page setup at the start of a chapter looked something like this. I did a little brush through of the book with my thumb because that's just kind of like what I do when I get a new book, and immediately noticed that several of the chapters, the formatting for that first chapter introduction page was off. The words weren't stopping or starting in the right place at all. For example, I remember a chapter ending on one page. Instead of picking up on the next page, the chapter started on that same page with all the formatting, and the bolded part wasn't bolded. Similarly, there was at least one chapter, I almost want to say two, where the final text of the last chapter spilled over into the chapter formatting for the next chapter. And this is without even making note of all of the many grammatical and spelling errors that were in this book. With both the first and second books now having been picked up by a traditional publishing company, I do imagine that all of these errors have been fixed. I didn't want to pay again for the book, so I checked out the only version available at my library, which was an audiobook. And honestly, a re-release was a good idea for this book and for the author. And I know that this could have all been mistakes made entirely independent of Jeremy Scott. I get that. There's the author, there's the editor, who should have caught the spelling and grammatical mistakes, but the publisher, the cover artist, and the person who formats the entire book. Jeremy Scott could have had nothing to do with any of these mistakes, and even at 15, I understood that. So that's why I didn't let it get in the way of me starting the book and reading the book all the way through and trying very, very hard to enjoy the book. The first thing to really get into with this book is the premise. This is the premise given on Amazon. It wasn't the sex talk he expected. Philip Salinger's dad has told him he's a custodian, a guardian, and his genetically inherited power is telekinesis. He'll learn to move objects with his mind. Excited to begin superhero high school until he discovers he's assigned to a special ed class for disabled empowered kids, he suddenly feels like an outsider. Bullied, threatened, and betrayed, Philip struggles even as he and his friends, calling themselves the ABLES, find ways to maximize their powers to overcome their disabilities, and are the first to identify the growing evil threatening humanity. As vital custodians disappear and the custodian leadership is mirrored in indecision, a mysterious and powerful figure taunts Philip, and the enemy is poised to strike. And what if the next, one who does all, the multi-gifted custodian practice to come, is one of the ABLES? Reading this premise is a little weird after having just read the book all the way through because it really highlights how hard it is to actually pinpoint the plot points. But like I said, when I initially heard about this book, I was super engaged with the premise. So to have disabled superheroes and then to really look into how that might affect them, how it affects how they're treated, how they think of themselves. What if you have a superpower, but your disability makes the superpower essentially void? How do you function in a super society having no access to what have made you a part of that niche society? I was ready for this. There's so much you can do with this. There's one line in that premise given on Amazon that in hindsight really paints a very bright red flag. The line is, as he and his friends find ways to maximize their powers to overcome their disabilities. We'll get to that. So I read this book back in 2015, and honestly, I've forgotten most of the things that happened in it because it's been 5 years and it wasn't something that I even enjoyed reading when I did read it. But upon hearing about the release of the second book in the series? Trilogy? Whatever it's supposed to be, I decided to give it another read-through. To first of all see if it was as disappointing as I remember it being, and then two, because I want to read the second book and see how it compares to the first. So without further ado, here are my thoughts and opinions after reading this book for the second time. Major spoilers from this point on. And so we have chapter 1. I'm not going to go through this book chapter by chapter because we don't have all day, but the first chapter and the second chapter too, they kind of spill into each other, are very good indicators of the experience that you're going to get reading the rest of this book. So let's start here, but actually real quick, let's backtrack for a second because this story actually has a prologue before the first chapter, but there isn't an epilogue, so anyways, the prologue kind of reminded me of the opening lines of Percy Jackson and the Olympians, the first book, where essentially in the start of that book, Percy Jackson is the narrator, is his voice, but like in an undecided future, I suppose, and he essentially at the beginning of this book has this little warning that's like, hey, if any of the events that you were reading about starts to sound familiar, you should probably stop reading because the more you know, the more in danger you are, kind of thing. It's like a couple lines, it's not even a prologue, and then it just immediately jumps into the actual story. Not in the ABLES. The prologue provides absolutely no information about the rest of the story that you're about to read. It's just a very cliched and typical narration that continues to say, like, the world is different now, and things have changed now, and now that things are different, I'm gonna tell you what happened. But it goes on for so long. And this is even in the second edition from 2019. From all my experience in writing and editing and anything with the English language, I know that a professional editor would have cut this part out immediately, no second thought, no questions asked, in the first read through. And then the first chapter starts. Both the first and second chapters, which honestly should have just been one chapter, take place around Philip, our main lad, getting the talk from his dad. He thinks it's going to be the sex talk, but instead he's getting told that he's a superhero, which is fine, and I get that it was supposed to be comedic in that value, but it goes on for so long. It is harped on for so long that this kid thinks that he's getting the sex talk, but doesn't end up getting the sex talk. It takes so many pages before the talk begins, and just all of those pages are him talking about how much he does not want to have the sex talk with his dad. But yes, so this kid's a superhero, and he's a superhero from a long line of superheroes on both sides of his family, and this new town that they just moved to is a safe zone for superheroes like their family. And they moved there so that him and his little brother could get a education on superheroes while still being safe, and so that they could learn about their powers in a good superhero-friendly environment. Look at that. I told you all of that in like less than a minute. The first chapter alone, just the first one, not the first and second, just the first one, goes on for 40 minutes. Audiobook time. At this point, I was so happy that I had gotten the audiobook version because I just turned the speed up all the way to ×3 and let it come out in 10 to 15 minutes instead of 40. 40 minutes. And it's boring. Nothing eventful is happening. It's literally just exposition. It's just him having this talk with his father. The first chapter is just this kid thinking he's about to get the sex talk from his dad, and then not getting the sex talk with his dad, and then his dad telling him he's a superhero. That's it. 40 minutes. The second chapter is essentially another 21 minutes of exposition where they're laying down all the groundwork for all the information you're going to know for all the twists and turns throughout the rest of the book. Overall, it's well over 50 minutes of exposition dumping. Wait a minute. Isn't that something that they sin when reviewing other people's stuff? The first chapter is so unimaginative. Of all of the ways I have read or seen a young hero discover they have powers, being sat down by somebody in a cornfield and being told it, just like, yeah, by the way, you have powers, is maybe not the worst, but it's definitely one of the lousiest. It's almost like that scene with Hagrid in the first Harry Potter book, the "You're a wizard, Harry" scene. But in Harry Potter, we're already cued into the fact that he might have these abilities based on the events that take place prior to him being told this. And in these instances, we were demonstrated the abilities before they were explained to us what they are. We're just told them in this book. And then the, wait, I know what you have. I know you have telekinesis because I saw you do it, is also just told to us by his dad. But I still cannot help but think that the "You're a wizard, Harry" scene is exactly what the author was trying to emanate in this scene. By the time you spent an hour with this book, you have gone with the main character from his room to a car ride to a cornfield, and that's it. So much information is just dumped on you in the first few chapters. And I'm not even talking about the exposition because I already harped on that. Just random rambles about the characters that never comes back in ever. And the information that will come back in later is often repeated so often that you begin to pick up on what's going to happen before anything else is introduced. Philip, our narrator, has like 2 to 3 paragraphs dedicated to explaining the way in which his dad starts serious conversations with him and his younger brother. Other serious talks do come up in this book, but they're never started with these weird cues that he has to clue us in on and talk about for way too long that brings nothing to the story. It's just 5 unnecessary minutes that doesn't progress the story in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't even help with the understanding the characters because it never comes back in. It's never something that we get to witness. It's just something that we're being told. Another whole section is given to explaining to us that his father tells very unfunny jokes. Again, telling, not showing. It's done to emphasize that immediately upon being told you're a superhero, he thinks that his dad's trying to make an unfunny joke. But instead of the one sentence that would have been necessary to convey this, like, is he joking? Is this another one of his unfunny jokes? He just rambles for a very long time about it. And like, his dad tells maybe one joke for the rest of the story, so why was that necessary to hark on that for so long? This happens a lot. No wonder it's over an hour into the story before this one event is even finished, and this one event isn't even an interesting event. It's just a talk. And the info dump in the second chapter, holy hell. It's just question, answer, question, answer. Same setting, same characters for over 20 minutes. 20 more minutes. Even as I was hearing it, I couldn't believe that he had the galls to try and get away with this after this is something that he critiques on other people and other creators so much. Could you imagine if a movie that they were reviewing did that? The sin counter would just start doing that thing where it just rolls forever. Yet he just sticks his info dump in, and he sticks it in at the very beginning of the book, no less. Within just the first chapter, the dead grandfather, who was a very powerful superhero and who is definitely dead, is mentioned thrice. So I'm just gonna go out on a limb and assume he's not dead. And at this point, 2 chapters in, I had to stop reading because I was stumped by a very simple question. Who is this story for? Like, what's the target audience? I looked it up and it said 12 to 18, so like, young adult, right? Which sure, YA is notoriously undefined, but the events of this book are very, very juvenile. And that's not supposed to be an insult either. The things happening and the way that they are happening and the way that characters engage with the things that are happening, well, it feels like it's for a younger audience, like a 12-year-old audience, which makes sense. The main characters are all 12. And there's even this moment amongst all the exposition when our main character is just told, doesn't figure it out, doesn't demonstrate it in any cool and interesting way that would engage the audience, just told that he has telekinesis. And our otherwise self-proclaimed intelligent main character, who uses whom correctly in exchanges of dialogue, and who also talks a lot about how he likes comic books and knows a lot about superheroes, asks what telekinesis is. But it feels like a question for the benefit of the audience, as if the reader might not know what that word means, as if that reader is younger. So it feels like the reader is supposed to be around 11, 12, 13. Plus, every adult is a caricature of an adult, another typical aspect of books written for a younger 12 plus, not YA audience. There's a lot of accidentally stumbling into the next clue within this book, a big emphasis put on friendship, no thought is given to girls or romance, and the bad guy is very cartoony. And all of that is fine for a younger audience, for like the audience of the first Percy Jackson book, or the first Harry Potter book, or the Sisters Grimm books, or those Spiderwick Chronicles books. Like that audience, that target audience, that's fine. So what? Amazon marked it wrong. It's for 12 plus, not 12 through 18. Big whoop, get over it. I'm not done. The events all feel like they should be for a younger audience, but the tone and the way things are handled totally throws that out the window. The story is narrated from our main character as if the events have already transpired. The prologue, which talks about how things are going to change, and you'll know what that means soon enough, seems to imply that Philip is telling us all about this close after the end of the book, as at the end of this book, the one person who controls the memory wipe thing is taken out, off camera of course, and now the world is getting ready to know about superheroes, and the superheroes are preparing to be known. But I cannot stress enough how much the narration feels like it's coming from an adult. It's like the narration in A Christmas Story, but with zero of the charming reminiscence, and with all of the undermining sarcastic judgment that was never in A Christmas Story. Plus, he often talks about his childish behaviors and understandings as if they are years beneath him. Like, not behind him, beneath him. Like, even him viewing himself and his actions and his friends' actions, he sees it all as so juvenile and childish and silly, which also supports the he's an adult understanding of the narrator more. This complicates the fact that it could be well received by a 12 plus audience, because everything the 12-year-olds do is treated and talked about in this very condescending way. The narrator is so condescending towards his 12-year-old main characters. I don't understand how this could be for 12-year-old boys when the narrator spends the entire book complaining about 12-year-old boys. When it does try to be reminiscing, like A Christmas Story, it misses the short and to the point idea altogether. There are pages in one chapter just explaining how much holidays mean to the main character, and they just completely stop the flow of everything for him to just hark on how much Halloween is great and Christmas is great, but his mom handles Christmas weird. And all of this is without considering the fact that a lot of people die in this book. And I guess it could be called dark because of that, or gritty, but it never felt dark or gritty because it's this very lighthearted book about these boys who are doing lighthearted things with a villain who is cartoony and ridiculous, but then at the same time, actual people are getting killed in very violent ways, and it's very negatively impacting the main characters and kind of making our main character lose his mind a little bit. And it's a really weird juxtaposition between this feels like it's for a kid, but also what the heck is all this other stuff? And it wasn't even sad. Like, I wasn't sad when these characters would die. I'd be like, oh my gosh, really? That just happened? This doesn't fit at all. The target demographic is confused because the author himself is confused. I don't think there's anything more to it than that. And not to hark too much on the villain, but he really is a highlight of this weird juxtaposition of it trying to be this dark and gritty and maybe even for adults kind of thing, but also being stuck in this childish narrative. The villain is said to speak almost with a British accent, which first of all, like, what the heck does that even mean? But also, that's another cliche right there. And he's mocking and exaggerated and never shuts up. Holy hell. It's this old man who is totally not the main character's grandfather. He keeps running into this group of 12-year-olds as he's trying to figure out the plans to his evil plot to do something or another, and instead of using his immense power to incapacitate them or scare them away or even just kill them, honestly, he teases them with a little information and then vanishes. And of course the adults don't believe them because a man with ridiculous superpowers in a town full of super-powered people? Yeah, no, that seems way too far-fetched. And then there's this scene, and I laughed out loud when I read this because honestly, I couldn't help it. The gang of disabled kids are trick-or-treating, and they think they see the bad man that they saw before and try to tell the adults, and the adults didn't believe them. And so they follow him, naturally. And he's with all these other people, and there's this giant crater in the ground, and it looks like they're building something or looking for something. It's never fully explained, but that also doesn't matter because it literally never comes back in ever again. So the gang is spying on him, but he knows they're there, naturally. So 6 hours and 14 minutes into a 14-hour book, this man appears behind them, all jump scary, tells the 12-year-olds to follow him, shows them his evil plan, tells them everything they need to know about his evil plan, and then goes, I shit you not. Oh no, since you know everything, I have to kill you. I really don't want to. He says that like 100 times. I promise, but I have to kill you now. Like, sir, what? He is such a bad villain. Yeah, he's like uber powerful or whatever. He's an absorber, so he can take on the powers of any of the superheroes around him at any time. So yeah, that's like a cool power and it's threatening, and so he should be like this cool and threatening person, right? But he's written so bad. He is a joke. He is more cartoony than an original Scooby-Doo villain, but it's played off so seriously. Like, you're supposed to take him so seriously. And he does do really bad things. Like, he freaking kills somebody. I'll get into that later, but he kills somebody. And it should be really menacing that this man just killed this person without a second thought. But everything else about him is just so ridiculous that even though he's doing this really bad villainy thing, I still can't take him seriously. He kills Philip's mom, by the way, which is a big deal. But it's so cartoony. And the motivations make no sense either. Not sense if you're sane. Maybe if they had played him more like, oh, he's insane, he does things without thinking, he's very archaic, he has no self-control, then a lot of the things that he does would make a lot more sense. The fact that he just always tells his plans to a bunch of 12-year-olds, the fact that he just kills this mom even though it actually hurts his plan in the long run, like all this stuff that he does, it would make more sense. But he's played off as like this attuned, British, fine, classy, smart, intelligent, knows all of the things that are gonna happen all the time kind of man, and it just doesn't fit. The actions and how the writer wants us to perceive this person do not fall in line with each other. And so the mom dies, and I honestly didn't feel anything but a giant huh while reading it. He puts her in a coma at first. After Philip calls her, she's a teleporter, that's her superpower, because the big bad guy's trying to kill Philip and his friends for knowing the plan that he told them. And she shows up. He puts her in a coma with one of his many superpowers, and it's to keep the kids quiet? That's what he threatens, at least, like you tell she dies. But like, more people see this man than just these kids, because he turned into a dragon and basically set everything on fire. And people know most stuff about what was just happening there. They now believe the kids on what they said before with this man, and that's even without the boys saying anything to add any information to it. And so then, like, other things happen, and the unrelated bad guy, shows back up into Philip's life, and he's like, join me, or I'll kill your mom. And Philip's like, no. So then she dies. And it's just like, why not just kill her at first of all? Because then that could have at least been this, oh, she was in my way, and I just killed her without thinking. With it being this very intentional thing that he does later, it completely hurts his plan in the long run. It doesn't help his goal or mission or bad guy extravaganza at all. In fact, it's a big reason why he doesn't get what he wants, which any person who wanted what he wants could have known and then not done that, because that would definitely not get you what you want, which, again, in a minute. So then, are we supposed to see him as like this heartless killing machine with no regard for other people's lives? There's a part at the end with like the big conflict, big resolution thing that's going on, and Philip straight out asks this guy, he goes, why did you kill my mom? He does it a little bit more passionately than that, but you get the idea. And it's a valid question. I also wanted to know. And Evil Man goes, she was nothing more than the ants I step on walking down the sidewalk, or something like that, which I guess is fine, except This is Philip's grandfather. Like, the man that raised his dad, who is a great and kind and noble person. This man was a great hero who saved countless people until one day his best friend apparently turned on him in a mission. His best friend had the power to take away powers from everybody else, so he took away his powers, and then he was struck down by a bad guy and died. In the book, the friend who betrayed him comes back in at the end to help defeat him after figuring out that it's him who's doing all this stuff, but like never explains why he randomly betrayed him. Like, it is very much enunciated that this was his best friend who just one day, for reasons unknown and undisclosed, just went, I don't really like you anymore, I'm gonna kill you. Like, not even I noticed a darkness growing in you and it scared me that could have kind of led into how the nice, kind superhero grandfather turned into this mass killing machine. Like, none of that. I guess he just woke up on the wrong side of the bed. So then, by that narrative, this Gramps guy was fine one day, got betrayed by his best friend, which I get it, it's a crappy situation, it would probably change a lot in your life, but this man does a full 180. He is not the same person in any way, shape, or form as he was before. And it's sold like the betrayal is what did this to him. So like, the blow that everyone assumed killed him, literally nobody checked. It's canon that nobody checked to see if it killed him. This guy was struck down, and everybody, including his best friend who had just tried to get him killed but then regretted it immediately afterwards, as he says that he did, just was like, oh, I guess he's dead, and just walked away and didn't check the freaking body or pick up the body or do anything with the body. This blow left a scar. It would have been something, at least, if maybe that blow and that scar was left to be the thing that changed his personality. Having been struck the way that he was, it wouldn't be a far stretch to say that maybe he suffered from severe brain damage. Brain damage that should have killed him but somehow didn't, like one of those miracle people who, this has happened before. I always remember the one man who got that nail stuck straight through his head from the railroad tracks, and even though he was alive and fine physically, his entire mental space and who he was as a person was completely shifted for the rest of his life, and he was unrecognizable as a person. That stuff actually does happen in real life, and to put that in a superhero book would actually be quite engaging and interesting to know that these very mortal issues could also affect somebody so powerful. And I'm not saying that everybody whose personality changes because of a brain injury turns into a homicidal maniac, but the thing is this man doesn't just want to kill everybody. That's not his motivation. That would be way too simple. It's so much more confusing than that. You see, there's this prophecy. What was I saying about cliches? This prophecy says that there will be a custodian who essentially has every single power, which honestly seems like a lot because there are apparently like thousands of superpowers out there in the world, from something as minimal as Excel brain power to being able to turn into a dragon. So how would that even work in one person? Anyways though, Gramps is a member of the Believers, a cult of sorts, very cleverly named because they believe in the coming of this specific person. To the rest of the custodial community, mention of all this is rather taboo because it is actually like a cult or something. And how Philip comes to all of this information too is so funny. He's in class, like, and he raises his hand and he goes, what are the Believers? And the reader has gotten no information or indication of the Believers before. This is the first time that it's mentioned at all within the course of the story. And the teacher's like, I'll answer your question, but first, like, how did you come to know that? Which, as the reader, you were also like, yeah, when did that come up? When was that a thing? And this kid just says, oh, I heard some kids talking about it in the hallway. That's it. That's how this person comes to this great information that is necessary to understand the course of this book. That's how it is dispelled then to the readers as well. And again, because it feels so much like I want to write Harry Potter, but with superheroes instead of magic. It reminds me of that scene in the second Harry Potter when Hermione like raises her hand and is like, what's the Chamber of Secrets? But at that point, so much has happened that would lead the kids to being curious about that because it was written in blood all over the walls just like a couple days ago. Like, that would be something that would be like, I'm gonna ask a question about that. Not just like this random thing that comes out of nowhere. So much information is just constantly being just told to us, rather than any attempt being made to show it. And it is always done in the laziest way possible. Usually there isn't even any dialogue that is being exchanged to convey information to the audience. It's just Philip telling you something. He'll tell you that he heard somebody say something, or he'll tell you that something happened rather than, showing it to you. He'll be like, oh yeah, and then the other day this happened, and so that led me to this conclusion. But yeah, so there's this prophecy, and the grandpa thinks that Philip is the person who will be the one who has all. And the prophecy is more than just like, there is somebody who will have all, and then they will come. It's like, it says something about this person sees the world differently, who suffers a great loss, and who comes into their powers to save everyone else. So the grandpa wanting this person with every power so that he can, I don't know, have them next to him at all times so that he could use their powers constantly so he could be the most powerful person too, so long as this person doesn't have any ill will towards him that might make them want to kill him or run away from him or hide from him or, not be next to his side, decides to cultivate the prophecy in Philip to make him the person that he thinks he is. He's already blind, Philip, so he sees the world a different way already. Check. Gramps kills his mom for the Great Loss bit, which he could have at least tried to cover being responsible for, because if he wants Philip on his side, I think killing his mom is actually the worst way to get him on your side even after he presents these powers you think he has. So why wouldn't you make the Great Loss happen if you so desire to, but do it in a way where nobody knows it was you? And then the villain, for the third point, to check off the list and make Philip the prophecy person, sets up this whole thing where everyone's locked in the school and it will blow up and kill everybody if Philip doesn't very suddenly come into all of his powers and save the day. That's this evil guy's plan. It's goofy and childish. And instead of just doing it, because honestly all of this doesn't need that much setup, he just walks around needing stuff and finding stuff and looking for stuff that's never disclosed to us, giving these 12-year-olds clues, prancing around doing all the stuff that would make Philip hate him in front of him and to his face. He's a crappy bad guy. Okay, so now this is the part that I have been kind of avoiding a little bit. The biggest selling point of this book in the premise was that the main characters and the superheroes that we're following around are all kids with disabilities. And that's, I mean, I guess it's true. The thing with this point too is that I do have respect for Jeremy Scott for trying to do this, for wanting to do this. And if any single person out there read this book and felt represented by it or engaged with it or loved it, I would never want to take that away from that person. But the way disabilities are handled in this book is lazy and problematic. So I'm going to talk about it. In fact, if it wasn't for just this point, I probably would have never been worked up enough to reread this book just so that I could make this video, but then also so I could read the next book to make another video about it and see if it does it any better. I mentioned it already in the premise, but a lot of emphasis is given into overcoming disabilities. Not finding a way to live with them, not using their powers alongside their disabilities, but overcoming them entirely, like getting rid of them. Because both characters are blind, I think it's a fair comparison to note Philip in this book versus Toph from the Avatar. Toph is a blind girl who is also the best earthbender in her world. The earthbending is actually what acts for her as a fill-in for what she misses seeing with her eyes. She cannot see her surroundings, so she feels them around her instead, using her feet. This is of course helped by her special ability, earthbending, but in real life, people who are blind use all kinds of amazing techniques to fill in those pieces that they can't. I always think of that blind man who uses echolocation like a bat and can ride a bike and identify where trees and people and benches and all kinds of stuff are just by making sounds with his mouth and listening to them. Like, wow, that's incredible. That's like a superpower all on its own. Given the properties of the world that she exists in, Toph is an amazing character. And an amazing blind character. She uses her bending and her lack of sight together. And because she doesn't rely on her sight at all, which most people do, she has this edge in fighting that actually helps make her a better earthbender. All the while, the limitations that are set around her blindness never go away. Without steady ground, things grow fuzzy. She still will always lack the world of the sighted, too. She can't read written language or identify colors or even see her friends' faces or know what she herself looks like. She doesn't have to stop her blindness to be powerful. She doesn't have to get rid of it in its entirety in order to be somebody who is capable in this world. She uses it with her abilities, and they work together. And because of both the bending and the blindness, she is the greatest earthbender of all time. Philip literally overcomes his blindness by gaining sight. His best friend Henry, a kid with mind powers, mind reading powers, who is immobile and has a wheelchair, sends his visual feed to Philip's mind to give him his sight back in a weird loop around about halfway through the book. And I also cannot express just how poorly this is done either. I love reading books with altering perspectives from my own. I love reading stories about people who have gone through something or are going through something that's entirely outside of anything I've ever experienced, because it gives me a way to see things and to view things and to feel for things that I otherwise may have missed entirely in just my own life, such as being blind. I was so excited to read a story about a blind character from the point of view of a blind character, to have that character be the main character. I was so excited that there was this superhero element to it that was so empowering and could be so wonderful, and I was so quickly turned off by this book. Through carelessness maybe, not fully understanding what it's like to be blind, lack of editing, maybe all of the above, but Jeremy Scott really proves that he is inept of doing this. In the first chapter, immediately after it is disclosed to the audience that our main character has been blind since birth, he instantly pictures a blue and silver trimmed cape in his mind. He wouldn't know what colors are. He's never seen them. And these little mistakes are just riddled throughout the narrative. He's also described as having very visual dreams, when one quick Google search tells me that blind people dream very differently from seeing people. And then Henry gives him his sight back. He sends it into his brain. He's seeing them now for the first time, and he knows what every color is, who every person is, and what every object is, and what the object objects that he has only ever touched look like, to the point of recognizing a gavel all the way across the room. Another quick Google search tells me that people who were once blind but then got their sight back later on in life could not visually identify many objects they had previously only interacted with through touch. Not to mention that suddenly being able to see would be very, very jarring. And he only pauses for a moment. There's a line shortly afterwards, and it's fine, but it's stupid. It's trying to be funny, and it almost is, except for the stupidity surrounding the line. Philip mentions that seeing Henry for the first time, he realized that he was black, and that thought had never occurred to him before. And yeah, that is kind of funny, and it really highlights kind of this, like, oh, you're a kid, you don't really think about that stuff that often, except for when you're being presented with it. But how would he know what a black person looked like? Even if somebody had described it to him when he was blind, this is right after he gets his sight back. How could he look at skin color for the first time and pinpoint it on a color scale that doesn't exactly match the actual colors of skin most of the time, while also having no actual awareness of what color is to begin with? And also, even the workaround that's been presented to give Philip his sight back doesn't even make sense most of the time. Why would he be looking at Henry to make this comment if he's watching the world now from Henry's POV? These are Henry's images that he's giving to Philip. If he's seeing from Henry's point of view, Henry's feed, he should only be seeing himself in this situation. This slip-up happens all the time in this book. So up until this point, the slip-up was that the author would make points, that the author would make little slip-ups in sentences and dialogue and exchanges and conveying information that forgot that our main character is blind. After this point in the book, the point of view that his sight is supposed to be coming from gets slipped up all the time. It's eventually given a workaround where Henry starts carrying around a computer that's seeing from glasses that Philip is wearing, so that Henry can give Philip a vision of what Philip would actually be seeing if he could see. But before that comes up, the author often, and I do mean often, forgets that his main character is supposedly only seeing from somebody else's perspective. And one scene, Philip sees the bad guy come up behind himself because he is seeing through Henry's eyes and Henry is looking at him. In another scene, he is constantly mentioning the way that Henry is looking at people, that he's looking at Philip as if he understood, and that he's casting a wary eye at a guy named Chad, often throughout the night. And it's like, I can't see if me myself is making a weary expression at somebody else from my point of view. Why would he be able to? If you're seeing from his perspective, you wouldn't be able to know the facial expressions that he is making. Good God, unless there's a mirror in front of him. It's explained at 8 hours and 48 minutes that when Philip goes to the bathroom in this one scene, he can still latch on to the feed that he's getting from Henry, so he's still seeing everything that Henry's seeing. Which seems like it would cause some issues. It's never brought up the issues that this would really bring, except for on a couple occasions, like walking into things and tripping over things or thinking something's in front of you when it's not because you're seeing it from kind of a skewed perspective. So that is how it works. He sees things only from Henry's point of view. Why can't the author remember that? Once this workaround is established about halfway through the book that Philip can now see, the author dedicates so much energy and space within this novel to making sure that Philip is always able to see throughout almost the rest of the events in this book. He is almost always in a place where he is receiving images from somebody else, and even when Henry stops, sometimes other people will step in to give him images as well. Even though this is supposedly like something that they just came up with, like nobody's ever told him that he could do this before. And my question is, at this point, why even make your main character blind? You obviously don't want to write from the point of view of a blind person, or about a blind person, or have a blind person be your main character. No one's making you write this character blind. Nobody's making you have a blind character in your book. That's something that you chose to do. And while I'm glad that people are more and more making this choice, you can't be representative by having disabled characters in your book if you spend the entire book trying to make them not disabled. You're not being representative at that point. You're being problematic. All of the other main kids are disabled too, as mentioned, though Philip's disability is the only one of the main cast that actually hinders his superpower to some extent, since it's hard to move things with your brain if you can't always see those things. You don't know where it is, what it looks like, etc. Henry can do the mind thing, which isn't inhibited by his wheelchair. Bentley, another character, has a super brain and cerebral palsy. James is another one of the characters. He's also blind, but he's a teleporter, and even though it does limit him a little bit, he's very adamant about the point that he is very good at teleporting regardless of his blindness. And then there's Donnie, who has Down syndrome, and whose powers for most of the book are kind of a mystery. And then there's Chad. Chad was a cliche bully who did cliche bully things to Philip until he was sent to a cliche boot camp by his cliche kind of abusive father. There he lost his arm. When he lost his arm, he came back, and having lost his arm, he repents to Philip for all the things that he did, and actually ends up joining their gang, called the ABLES, for the disabled kids, now that he himself has a disability. He can turn invisible. And he was almost something that I can get behind in this book. I was like, oh, oh, okay, that's a little different. But he immediately goes back to being a cliche when he betrays the entire group and ends up being on Team Gramps the whole time. And he had his arm taken off so that he could join the disabled kids and trick them, foil their plans, and go back to Gramps and tell him all the stuff that they were about to do and going to do, which would have never needed to happen either if Gramps would just stop telling a bunch of 12-year-olds all of his evil plans all the time. So yeah, those are your main characters. And it's fine that every disability doesn't affect the characters and their superpowers directly. That's totally fine and acceptable. It is just a little odd because there are a lot of other kids in their special ed class who do have superpowers that are immediately affected by their disabilities, and they're never really allowed to be in their gang. So take of that what you will. There's also the scene when the ABLES are petitioning to be allowed in the superhero competition after having been banned by it by the school board because the school board thinks that they're a danger to other people and themselves. And this is a very interesting plot point to engage with, even if it's not handled very well. Again, I respect what was trying to be done here. This is when Philip gets his sight back, but the hearing still goes really terribly, and they're about to lose and just be told that they're not allowed to compete. This is when their homeroom teacher steps in, and she starts calling out the board on all of these things that made them dangerous as kids, but also any disability that they have now in their older age, or any affiliates that they have who happen to be disabled. And it's like to humble them or something, or to show them that they're being hypocrites. Somehow this works, and the kids are allowed to compete, but there's this line that she gives when she's talking to the board, where she says, "I'm extremely proud of each and every one of you, and think you are all model citizens in the society of yours. Whatever your demons were in your youth, you've risen above them and gone on to have successful careers, making valuable contributions to this fine city." And then she says, "And those of you with connections to disabled individuals, prove your heart's true nature every day simply by having those relationships." No, you are not a good person with a true heart because you affiliate with a disabled person, because a person with a disability is your secretary, because you're related to somebody with a disability. That's not how that works. Treating a disabled person like a person doesn't make you a special kind of person. It doesn't show your true heart. It doesn't get you brownie points, okay? Treating a disabled person like anything less than a person actually just makes you a massive though. This right here is why Jeremy Scott really reveals himself to be incapable of completing the story in a way that would do justice to the people he's trying to represent. This speech and even this line is seen as a good thing. It gets an applause. It gets cheered at. People are grateful to her, both the disabled kids who now get to compete because she said that, and everybody else who was shown they're being wrong because of it. This scene, this line allows these kids to compete. It's just a little insulting, don't you think? God, and also like, I don't think that this was intentional at all, mind you, but why is the only person of color in this entire book, also the only African-American person in the whole book, why is he the one that is just expected? He's never asked if he wants to, and the inconveniences of it are never brought up, not once. Why is he just expected to follow the main character around everywhere he goes to provide him with sight, having later to even carry around a computer all the time to continuously give the main character sight? And he just does whatever Philip tells him to all the time, showing up whenever Philip tells him he needs him to be somewhere. It's just like, why? It's a representative issue. It's one of those things where there was a lot of representation in this book. This wouldn't stick out so much under all these negative connotations, but because it's literally the only representation that we give ethnic diversity, it stands out, and it stands out in a really bad way. I'm choosing to think that this wasn't intentional, but the way that it comes across is still really, really messed up, and I think it should have been pointed out way before it got to this point. Okay, so we're almost done here. Let's just power through a little bit more. The Super Sim is stupid. The Super Sim is the competition the kids were petitioning to get into. It's where kids all team up in groups of like 7, and then the adults act like criminals, and the kids try to stop them, and the more criminals you stop, the more points you get, and whoever has the most points wins. It's a training exercise. The whole thing in this is that the kids with disabilities are seen as inherently more dangerous than everybody else, and so that's why they were barred from playing. And this highlights a huge conflict that goes on within this book with these disabled kids, and the treatment towards them that gets solved a lot like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer gets solved. Cruel torment and disregard until they prove that they are useful to society, and a dangerous situation where they defeat the bad guy instead of, I guess, the fog, and then they're considered heroes and everybody loves them. Yay! The point is, this competition is dangerous for everyone. Like, they had to cancel it several years back because a blind kid flew into a seeing kid, and they both died in the accident that followed during one of these Super Sims. But how do people not die in this thing every year? And the property damage, oh my goodness. this. Philip gets into a bunch of trouble for exploding a bunch of people's cars, but like, that stuff has to happen all the time. And why would you even put your physical possessions in a place where a bunch of teenagers with superpowers are trying to blow stuff up all the time? That just sounds like a recipe for disaster. Why is this done anywhere in the town? Why isn't it barred off to like a field or something? And it's mentioned too after this that there's like super sim insurance that covers all the property damage. What insurance company would be stupid enough to insure a competition of teenagers who are notorious for destroying things? What benefit do you get out of that? What gain is there in that insurance? And the whole thing is put on by their school, which is almost a normal school. It has most of the same stuff that a normal school would, with just some sprinklings of superhero stuff in here and there. Even in the school, you're not allowed to use your powers, and there is a person, one of the superheroes, who has that ability to take away superpowers in a zone that they can create, who lives in the school and nobody knows who they are, and they keep everybody from using their powers all the time. And my thing is, shouldn't this school be teaching these kids a lot more about their powers and how to use them? Everything they learn practicing by themselves. So this just makes the super sim even dumber, because it's not even like these kids have been trained by the school who's putting on this competition to be able to do well and perform well in this competition. Like, let's just throw a bunch of kids who we haven't helped or helped train at all, let's throw them into a dangerous situation, and then act real surprised when things get broken and people get hurt. And they do get hurt, and it happens to the ABLES group. But the way that they were hurt and what happened wasn't because of anybody's disability. It's kind of played off like that's the case, but honestly what happened could have happened to any group of people, whether they were disabled or not. And it was honestly all just Philip's fault too, and Chad, who sabotaged them, causing the whole thing to happen. But they're still treated like it was their disabilities that caused everything to happen and not like a freak accident, and they never look into further how that freak accident even happened, which is kind of why all these bad people are allowed to exist and these 12-year-olds keep on having to put up with this old man, is because stuff happens that should raise alarms, and just everybody's like, oh, it's just because they're disabled, and then it's just let go, which is really crappy. The way that Donnie's character is handled, he's the one with Down syndrome, is probably one of the things that I'm not super sure about with this book. On the one hand, he actually ends up being the one that the prophecy is about, which I think is super cool, and a good suspension of disbelief, because the whole time you're like, of course it's going to be the main character, it's always the main character. So to have it be a side character and to have the representation in that side character was kind of neat, and I did actually like that even the first time that I read it. But on the other hand, the way that he's treated throughout the rest of the book is really cruel. He just gets used by Philip and the others, constantly. They call him their friend, but they're usually using him in some capacity. It's mentioned several times that the only reason that Philip even mentions that he's not at school at a certain day and he misses school a lot is because the bullies will start picking on Philip and the others, and Donnie usually scares the bullies away. In fact, the only reason that they ever really let Donnie hang around them at all is because they know that the bullies are scared of Donnie. Philip admits to using him as kind of a buffer to just talk at so that he can focus and get his own thoughts figured out at times. And it's not like Donnie ever really talks back, but the lack of interest that Philip especially, but also the others just have in Donnie as a person is just really insulting. Like, they never figure out who his parents are. Even after something really bad happens at the end and Donnie goes away, they never find out who his parents are. They never grieve with his parents. There's never this moment when they are interested in who he is as a person or what his upbringing is like. They really just kind of use him and keep him around for the benefits that they can get from him. And Philip gets Chad and Donnie hurt in the super sim, but the whole town just turns on Donnie instead. Like, these super adults with all these interesting and weird abilities, and they're not entirely understood, especially by the greater society. They all treat Donnie horribly. And then Donnie at the end saves everyone and disappears, and they're all really salty about it and mean to him still. And like, Philip is barely even sad that his friend disappeared. And this does kind of go back to how the main character just treats everybody in this book. It is very insulting. The characters in this book all exist just to benefit the main character. Everything about them is so that the main character can be more powerful. Henry, the main character's best friend, is just there to give him sight. And Bentley, the main character's other best friend, is the super smart one who provides him with all the plot details so that he can save the day. Donnie's just there to scare off his bullies and be there when he needs to talk to him and save the day last minute when he can't. And his mom's just there to die. The main character is inherently very selfish, and it's hard to root for him most of the time. And it's never played off like something that he needs to fix either, like a character flaw that he's working on. It's just kind of like, oh, this is who he is, and everybody loves him now because of this thing that he did. And I'm not a big fan of how anything in this book was handled. And even when I was in the targeted demographic, even when I was 15 years old reading this book, I could tell that there were major things wrong with it, and I was very disappointed with the outcome of all of the expectations I'd put on this. And I really do want to put a disclaimer that says that I don't hate that this book exists either, because at the end of the day, it still is representation. And even though not all representation is good representation, the more representation we have is definitely better. And I'm also disappointed in the carelessness that was given to handling these topics and the carelessness that was given. I'm just saying, if you're going to write about somebody with such a drastically different lifestyle than the one that you understand, you should take extra steps to make sure you understand that lifestyle. And you should ask people who live that lifestyle how they think about certain things if you're unsure about them. The internet exists. Find somebody, ask it on Reddit or something. And there are so many online resources for how to correctly represent people who are not usually represented, because when they are represented, it's usually done very poorly. Find those resources, read those resources, just put in more effort. And I really do think that if he had put in more effort, this could have been a much better experience than it was. So yeah, I unsubscribed. I threw the book away, and I really did it because if two people can build their entire identity and their entire brand around criticizing media for being unoriginal, not thought out, and cliched, and one of them can then turn around and write something that is very unoriginal, super not thought out, and super cliched, while also being problematic, well then, that's hypocrisy, baby. Just go watch Sky High instead, honestly. It doesn't have any disabled superhero characters, which is a disappointment. I think that would have been really cool to throw in there, but it's still better than this. This reads like a first draft, and honestly, with a lot more work and time, and with a competent editor, this maybe could have turned out okay. If I had to describe this book in 2 words, it'd be careless and unoriginal. With that, I rate it probably a solid 1.5 out of 7, because I hated / despised this book because of how problematic and disappointing it was. Please await the next part of this review in which I do the second book. I really do have high hopes that it will be at least a little bit better, because I mean, it has been 5 years, and 5 years is a long time to grow as both a person and an author. But yes, look forward to that, and until then, if you liked this video, please like, please subscribe, please look forward to my new stuff. I have a few more videos in mind that I'm really excited to make, so I hope you'll stick around from that. Please comment your thoughts below. Tell me if I was being too harsh, or if you agreed, or if you read it, or by God, if you liked it, please tell me what you liked about it. The author gives this like really long explanation too for like why the group decides to call themselves the ABLES, and it has like all this stuff to do with like there was this historical group of superheroes and there were only a couple of them, and there were all these big baddies and there were so many of them, so it was a small group against this big group and the odds were against them, and so they decided to call themselves the ABLES because they decided that they were able to take on these big numbers. And it's very, very long and winded, this huge explanation. And the whole thing is that like it doesn't really tie into this group of heroes who are now calling themselves the ABLES. There's no like mirror image between the two, and at the same time it's unnecessary to have these really long explanations too, because it would make total sense if these kids who are being treated unfairly in the school, who are being identified strictly by their disabilities, are like, screw you, no, we are the ABLES, we are not the disabled, we are going to do things and you will watch us do these things and we will prove you wrong, so we are going to call ourselves this. It makes perfect sense, and it doesn't need this long-winded explanation behind it for them to pick this name for themselves. It fits, it's understandable, just go with it.